Feels good to be back in church. I really missed it. Passage I wanted to read, as Pastor Simi mentioned, was from Psalms chapter 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. You may be seated. We are living in fearful times, dark times, times of trouble and uncertainty. This dark plague has shook the world. But I have good news tonight. We are not facing these dark times alone. We have a good shepherd who takes care of us. In this beautiful Psalms, we see that King David had a real and vibrant relationship with God. And through this psalm, we see what that relationship was like. And he starts off the psalm by saying, "The Lord is my shepherd." You see, King David was conscious of the fact that the Lord was there, protecting him, providing for him, and caring for him all the days of his life. And King David lived with this in mind. He lived with the Lord's love in mind. Whenever he would give a decree or judge right or wrong, he knew that it was the Lord's grace that held him. And we see that little children know what it's like to be loved. I have a nephew and I have a couple nieces, and it's very evident that they're loved by their parents and by their grandparents. And in childhood, the child is loved by their parents, and it's very evident. They're kissed all the time. They're told that they're special, that they're loved, that they mean a lot. But then as they grow older and they become more independent, sometimes that love is not as visible. But you see, when we emerge from childhood and into adulthood, it's not that we become more independent in and of ourselves, but the mature and wise Christian knows that our dependency is always on God. Amen? And this was the secret that King David lived his life by, that he knew that he had a shepherd, and that the Lord was his shepherd. And that's why in Jude chapter 1, verse 21, it tells us and it instructs us to keep ourselves in the love of God, to be conscious of the Lord's love for us. The psalm goes on to say, "I shall not want." And I have learned in my life, and I'm sure many of you can testify, that the deeper you go into your relationship with the Lord, the less the things of this world become less of a concern for you. And they begin to fade. And you are so infused with the love of God, with the relationship of God, you really understand that this is the true meaning of life, to have a relationship with God. And "I shall not want" means that King David was satisfied. He was satisfied not in the things of this world although he had many possessions. He was a king. But he was satisfied in the Lord his shepherd. You see, greed and materialism and the love of the things of this world, they leave us empty. But the Lord does not leave us empty. The Lord fills us up. And that was the secret of King David, and that's what the Lord wants to do in your life, to fill you with his love and his presence and his goodness. And Apostle Paul learned the secret of contentment, that through every circumstance that he faced and every circumstance that we face, whether in lack or in plenty, we are content because the Lord is with us. And the psalm goes on to say, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And I love this passage. It's a passage of rest. You see, God gave King David rest in the midst of his troubles. King David was a man of war. He always had enemies, enemies without and enemies within. And there was always bloodshed during the reign of King David. But you see, King David had internal peace from God. Whatever situation he went through conscious of the Lord his God. And that gave him peace. That gave him courage. And Jesus did the same exact thing for the disciples when he gave the disciples courage and peace with the words that we find in John chapter 16, verse 33. Jesus says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Amen. You see, Jesus gives us peace in the midst of our troubles. He is our peace. And I love what C.S. Lewis said. He said, love with God is not immunity from difficulties, but peace in difficulties. We go on in the psalm. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, the valley of the shadow of death, many people believe that it is a literal place. And I don't think that there's enough scriptural evidence to support this, but I definitely think it's a possibility for there to be a literal place that David had in mind when he wrote this psalm, and that is the Valley of Kidron. And this was the valley that was on the east side of Old Jerusalem. And this valley, to this day, it is filled with tombs. And the reason why it's filled with tombs is because the Jewish people believe that when the Messiah goes through the east gate, the resurrection will happen and they will be resurrected. And so they want to be as close to the east gate as possible. And I understand that some of those tombs cost up to $1 million to be buried there. And King David was very familiar with this valley. It was right outside the walls of Jerusalem. And King David actually fled through here, through the valley, when he escaped his son Absalom, which is recorded for us in scriptures in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 23. And all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by. And the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on toward the wilderness. And you see what happened was a betrayal. King David's son, Absalom, betrayed King David. Absalom betrayed his own father. And his plan was to take the kingdom away from David. And I'm sure that when David was going through this valley, he had hurt, he had feelings of betrayal, of darkness that came over him. I'm sure he had questions for God. Had God abandoned him as he was going through this valley to escape through the wilderness? And we know the story of how Absalom was later killed, and King David would later come back and regain the kingdom. But it was a troubling and dark time for King David going through that valley. And perhaps an even more troubling time. And a greater event took place in that valley, which was right after the Last Supper. Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane through that valley, through the Kidron Valley. We see this recorded in John chapter 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And we know what took place there in the Garden of Gethsemane. How Jesus, in his preparation for the darkest moments of his life, in preparation for the cross, he went to the garden to be strengthened, to face the dark times of the cross. And he passed through this valley. But he was not alone. In John chapter 16, verse 32, Jesus had a prophecy to declare. He said, "Behold, the hour is coming. Indeed, it has come, when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and you will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me." And you see, in his darkest moments, Jesus himself dependent on the Father. Jesus himself knew and was conscious of the Father's love, of the Father's presence in his life. And this is our hope today, that in our dark times, in our troubling times, God is with us. Amen. And may Bethesda Church find hope in that. And may we find strength and rest in Jesus, our great shepherd, through these dark times. Amen.